I think anyone who's owned a decent computer in the past 20 years can tell you that Half-Life is a certified banger, and if you watched my last video, you know that the game's success took Valve straight to the top in terms of popularity as a developer. After quickly becoming one of the most recognizable names in the realm of PC games, Valve created the sequel that everyone was looking forward to. Half-Life 2 begins 20 years after the first game, with Gordon Freeman arriving on a train to City 17, the center of Eastern Europe's surviving human population. As soon as you step off into the station, it's pretty obvious that the world isn't the way you left it, and the player is welcomed into the city by a video of Dr. Wallace Breen, Freeman's former boss at Black Mesa, who's now the administrator of Earth. Your first objective is given to you by an undercover Barney Calhoun, the star of Blue Shift, who sends you off into the city in search of Dr. Isaac Kleiner's lab. Leaving the station is where you get your first real look into the world of Half-Life 2, seeing City 17's clash of old architecture and futuristic machinery with the monolithic citadel looming over the skyline. This new world you return to is an alien police state run by the Combine, an interdimensional empire who tracked down and laid claim to Earth after the events of the Resonance Cascade. This last bastion of human civilization in City 17 is one that some might describe as literally 1984. After a failed ambush by the Combine's civil protection, the player meets Alyx, Freeman's sidekick throughout the Half-Life 2 games and daughter of Eli Vance, a scientist who you actually met alongside Dr. Kleiner at the beginning of the first Half-Life. In Kleiner's lab, you get your trusty old HEV suit back, and after a failed teleportation to Black Mesa East, you're sent off with a crowbar to get there yourself. This is where the game actually starts. Right off the bat, Half-Life 2 shows you what it's all about as you pick up your first guns and learn to use the game's environment and physics engine to keep the upper hand in combat, especially through the opening's excessive use of props like explosive red barrels to teach you that Half-Life favors thinking outside the box more than it does sheer firepower. As you make your way out of City 17, Freeman receives an airboat from members of the human resistance. Here, Valve shows up more of the capabilities of their new Source engine. The destructible environment paired with drivable vehicles makes this section totally a blast. If you can't already tell, Valve knows how to hook players in with non-stop action right in the beginning of the game. After ramming your way through hordes of Combine troops and crossing the toxic wasteland outside of City 17, Freeman reaches Black Mesa East, the brains of the human resistance. Here we're greeted again by Eli and Alyx Vance alongside Dr. Judith Mossman, who gives Freeman the Half-Life series' second most recognizable weapon, the zero-point energy field manipulator, or just gravity gun for short. If Valve hasn't already done a fantastic job of showing off Source's physics engine, this is where you're given the ability to use nearly every prop in the game as a weapon, a tool, or the missing piece to a puzzle. By today's standards, physics like this can be mostly expected in a first-person shooter. But let me remind you that Half-Life 2 came out in 2004, the same year as games like Far Cry, Doom 3, and Metroid Prime 2. For a game that's nearly as old as I am, it's insane how advanced and modern the physics engine still feels today. After you're taught how to use the grav gun, the Combine begin an aerial raid on Black Mesa East, forcing you to escape down a tunnel to your next major location, Ravenholm. Ravenholm is my second favorite part of the entire game. This is where Half-Life 2 puts to use everything it's been teaching you so far, in the setting of a small hidden village ridden with headcrab zombies. Up to this point, the game has heavily suggested using physics props as one of your best weapons, but in Ravenholm you're swarmed with so many enemies at a time that using your firearms isn't really practical. Instead, you'll take advantage of pre-made traps to lure in zombies and crush them, or harness the power of the gravity gun to fling saw blades and explosive canisters at groups of them at a time. Later on, you come across the last surviving resident, Father Grigori, a strange Russian priest who gives you a shotgun, the weapon of choice when you come across the area's new toxic and fast headcrab zombies. There's even a section in Ravenholm that I'm not afraid to admit genuinely scared me, when you're temporarily confined to a small rooftop while waiting for help. No matter how many times I play the game, the claustrophobia of your small safe area being swarmed by zombies still gets to me. My only actual issue with this area is that it's where the gravity gun combat kind of peaks. As soon as you leave Ravenholm, you're pretty much expected to deal with all future enemies using your guns, outside of a few exceptions. I said at the beginning of this bit that it was my second favorite part of the entire game, but the next chapter is where things get even better. After leaving the zombie-infested village and regrouping with members of the human resistance, Freeman gets the game's second vehicle, the scout car. Highway 17 is where Half-Life 2 peaks for me, because in so many ways it feels like a parallel to my favorite part of the first game, On a Rail. In this segment, the player learns that Eli Vance has been taken to Nova Prospect, the Combine's industrial prison for so-called anti-citizens. With your new car, you're sent off to cross the dangerous coastal wasteland filled with many Combine and human resistance outposts. Here, Half-Life 2 almost feels like an open-world game. There's a sense of exploring that isn't present in any other area. The player is given options to stealth around and pick off enemies from a distance, or run into groups of Combine with all the firepower you've got. You can even use the car as a weapon itself because it's a heavy physics object, and comes pre-equipped with a mounted version of the Tau cannon from Half-Life 1. Highway 17 is the chapter of Half-Life 2 that I personally have the most memories with. In middle school, when I first got into the series, I could spend hours trying to explore every square inch of the coast, even though the chapter on its own can be easily completed in under 40 minutes if you know what you're doing. As you near the end of your journey, Freeman has to abandon the car and finish traveling to Nova Prospect on foot, with another new weapon given to you by a Vortigaunt in one of the human resistance outposts. The bug bait, which allows you to control large insect-like Zen aliens called antlions in order to fight back against the Combine without expending any ammunition. It's a cool concept, but in all honesty, I've spent so many of my earlier playthroughs of the game completely neglecting it, since the player's arsenal is already insanely powerful at this point to begin with. With the antlions on your side, you can storm the last heavily fortified stretch of the coast before reaching Nova Prospect and regrouping with Alyx Vance to search for Eli. Inside the facility, surrounded by Combine soldiers, you find Dr. Mossman, who teleports Eli and herself to the Citadel, leaving you stranded with no choice but to return to City 17 and meet with Dr. Kleiner again. After using the same teleporter as them, we find a distressed Kleiner back at his lab who explains we'd been stuck in some kind of teleportation loop for a week, and finally arrived at the other end after the complete destruction of Nova Prospect and the beginning of a full-scale human revolution inside City 17. This final act of Half-Life 2 follows Freeman, Alyx, and Barney leading the human uprising through City 17, destroying the center of the Combine's puppet government on Earth. This is where one of my least favorite mechanics comes into play. Right at the end of the game, when you're fighting groups of Combine alongside members of the human resistance, you can sometimes get grouped into squads with up to 4 people following you at a time. You might remember how much I absolutely hated the escort missions in Half-Life 1, and this honestly feels no different. The AI for following the player is marginally better this time, although there's still countless times when they'll get in front of you in a hallway or obstruct your path when just walking around a building. This mechanic is very short-lived, however, as we quickly reach the Citadel, the almost organic-feeling monolith at the center of the Combine's presence on Earth, where Dr. Breen, Mossman, and Eli await. Upon entering the Citadel, the player's weapons are all vaporized at a security gate except for one, the gravity gun, which now becomes supercharged and looks, at least to me, a little bit more recognizable. As you scale the Citadel using this more powerful variant of the grav gun to fend off hordes of Combine soldiers and elites, you eventually reach Dr. Breen's office, where Half-Life 2's plot has one last twist. The assumed traitor Dr. Mossman turns against the Combine and frees Freeman. This last sequence of the game sees the player destroying the reactor at the center of the Citadel, preventing Dr. Breen from escaping to the Combine's homeworld. I do have to say here that it feels a little anticlimactic. After the Nihilant in the first Half-Life, I went into this expecting some sort of actual boss fight, but to be completely fair, we will have those in later entries. After your task is complete and the reactor starts to blow up, the game freezes, and the G-Man appears. In similar fashion to the first game's ending, you're put into stasis after a short monologue and the credits roll. Half-Life 2 is probably the best we could have asked for in terms of a sequel to Valve's first hit. It takes the formula we've already come to know and enjoy from the first games and expands on it with new mechanics, enemies, and weapons, alongside an expanded story and universe that immerses you in a way that the original Half-Life never could. Part of me thinks I've been spoiled by the storytelling and some of the other more grand experiences I've had on games like the Xenoblade Chronicles series, although this doesn't take away from the fact that Half-Life 2 expands on the universe as the original and presents a story and characters that you actually want to see more of. The reason I'm leaning so hard into the story right now is that it was actually continued through a planned trilogy of episodic releases taking place right after the events of Half-Life 2. But as nearly anyone who spent time on the internet in the past decade knows, the Half-Life 2 series didn't exactly get to end gracefully. Half-Life 2 Episode 1 opens immediately after the explosion in the Citadel during the first game's finale, with Freeman waking up in the destroyed remains of City 17. A short cutscene in the beginning gives more context to the ending of the original game, showing a group of Vortigaunts somehow stopping the omniscient G-Man from putting us into stasis again. This stuff will end up being pretty important later on, so keep it in the back of your mind. Episode 1 is a relatively short game that took me a whopping 2 hours to complete. It brings back the vent crawling and irritating escort missions from the original Half-Life, but aside from that, it feels to me like it's generally lacking in content, aside from giving a little more story context to the ending of Half-Life 2, and a bit of what happens after. Most notably, a message the player receives from Dr. Judith Mossman, talking about a secret project that her team had discovered in the Arctic. Episode 1 can most easily be summed up as a waypoint between the original Half-Life and Episode 2, where stuff actually picks up quite a bit. The game ends with Freeman and Alyx boarding one of the last still-running Combine trains out of City 17. In the distance, the entire Citadel explodes, fading the screen to white before the credits roll. Likewise to the first episodic release, Half-Life 2 Episode 2 picks up right where we left off in the wreckage of a train far outside of what used to be City 17. Right off the bat, we have a huge change in setting for the Half-Life series, a very welcome addition and something that surprisingly still looks good in 2021. Out in the wilderness, Gordon and Alyx come across a communications building where we contact Dr. Kleiner and Eli Vance for a bit of story exposition. This is where I'm going to dump most of the lore for this video on you, so hold on to your seat for a minute. If you recall the first Half-Life, you probably remember the portal between Xen and Earth being closed after the Denialinth was destroyed. In the aftermath of the Black Mesa incident, however, Earth would fall victim to the Combine, an interdimensional empire that even Xen was afraid of. The opening of the rift between dimensions at Black Mesa acted as a sort of beacon, leading the Combine right to us, resulting in the 7 Hours War, exactly how long it took for the whole of human civilization to surrender to the Iron Fist of the Combine. Now in Episode 2, the Citadel has been destroyed in an attempt to create a super portal back to the Combine homeworld. If we can reach Kleiner and Eli at White Forest Base outside of City 17 and launch a satellite just like the one from Half-Life 1, we'll be able to close the portal for good, completely cutting off the Combine from Earth. And then Alyx gets Sephiroth'd. Thankfully, however, some Vortigaunts nearby have the capacity to heal her, glowing a faint purple that might only give you a second to recall the beginning of Episode 1 before the G-Man appears again. Now that the power of the Vortessence, the collective unconscious of the Vortigaunts, isn't focused on holding him back. In this G-Man monologue, we vaguely learn about some sort of connection he has to Alyx from back at Black Mesa, and are told to safely bring her to White Forest. Just as the G-Man disappears and Alyx wakes up, we're reminded to prepare for unforeseen consequences. By now you can probably tell that Half-Life 2 Episode 2 has far more story content than its predecessor, but it's also just way more fun. We get most of the weapons back that we've used in the previous Half-Life 2 games, as well as a new car. Even though the controls can be pretty garbage for vehicles in the Source engine, it's still my favorite part of the original game, and it's just as much of a blast in the wooded outskirts of the destroyed City 17. Throughout our trip, we come across new powerful hunter enemies, and are even put face to face with the telekinetic power of the Combine Advisor. On the road, there's also some basic puzzles and spots where we have to stop and take out the Combine coming after us. After not too long, though, we come across Dog on the road, who leads us right up to White Forest. At the base, we meet up with Kleiner, Eli, and one Dr. Magnuson from Black Mesa for another round of story exposition. Although this time, I think it's something you'll appreciate. When decoding the message from Dr. Mossman that you might remember from Episode 1, Dr. Kleiner finds another video attached, footage of the Borealis. You're seeing that right, the Aperture Science logo in Half-Life 2. It's explained that the Borealis was a ship in the Arctic filled with technology that could be used against the Combine, expected to be lost when it vanished years ago. On the other hand, Eli Vance suggests destroying the Borealis to prevent another Black Mesa incident. When we're left alone in the room with him, we get our biggest lore bomb of the series yet. Eli Vance is fully aware of the G-Man, referring to him as our mutual friend. It's even revealed that the G-Man was the supplier of the crystal from Half-Life 1 that caused the resonance cascade in the first place. Eli confesses that he has so much he needs to tell us, but gets cut off by Dr. Magnuson, who pulls Freeman away for Half-Life 2 Episode 2's final boss of sorts. As Kleiner prepares the satellite for launch, Combine Striders and Hunters begin surrounding White Forest. The player is sent off with a car, the gravity gun, and sticky bombs to take them all out and defend the facility. This is probably the most fun ending there's been to any Half-Life game to date, and I can kind of admit it does overstay its welcome a bit. The hordes of enemies are generally easy and fun to manage, but as more and more kept coming past the 20-minute mark, it got a little tiring. As soon as the last Strider is taken out though, you can drive right back to White Forest and make your way to the control room, where just like in Half-Life 1, Freeman has the privilege to press the big red launch button. Outside with Eli and Alyx, we get to witness the closing of the Combine super portal. Just as we're about to set off for Borealis, though, a Combine advisor breaks into the building and kills Eli Vance, rolling the credits on Half-Life 2 Episode 2. As sad as it is to say, we all know what happens next. Nothing. The Half-Life 2 anthology ended on one of the biggest cliffhangers in video game history, causing Half-Life 3 Confirmed to be one of the most widespread internet memes of the 2000s. As someone who only got into the series about 5 years ago, I can't imagine how much it would have stung to see those credits roll on Episode 2 not knowing it would be over a decade until the story was continued in any official way. But before taking a look at how the series came back to life in 2020, I wanted to first look back on the mid-2000s and early 2010s, a time that I'm finally old enough to say I'm nostalgic for. If you watched my first video on the series, you already know that Half-Life 1 was a powerhouse for community-generated content because of Valve's encouragement and freely available development kits. The Source Engine similarly had a development kit available to any Steam user who owned a Valve game on their account. By 2011, this was made even easier since Team Fortress 2 went free to play, making the Source SDK available for free to every account on the platform. The Source Engine would go on to be the basis of every Valve game from the time Half-Life 2 released until it was very recently phased out for Valve's brand new, aptly named Source 2 engine. During those nearly 15 years, there would be dozens of popular games and mods based on the Source Engine, just as there were for Gold Source. Some of the most notable ones, in my opinion, would be games like Gary's Mod and the Stanley Parable. Both of these started as mods for Half-Life 2, which would go on to be incredibly popular and spawn full standalone releases. Less so through Valve's own involvement, like in the case of some Half-Life 1 mods, but through the growing community of indie developers online. Some of these especially being helped out by the Let's Play scene of YouTube at the time. For me, the Source Engine and these games in particular bring back nostalgic memories of a YouTube Let's Play scene before the advent of games like Five Nights at Freddy's and Undertale, when one-shot videos based around smaller indie games was something new and exciting. This is the time when I have the most memories of watching people like the Yogscast and Markiplier or even Venturian Tale if you remember them. This indie Let's Play scene is even what inspired me to start uploading content in the first place. Believe it or not, but I was a pretty active member of the gaming commentary community between 2013 and 2016, although it took me until last year to find a type of YouTube video I consistently enjoyed making. Throughout the years, fan content thrived using the Source Engine, but Valve's own development of games slowed down to almost a complete halt during the 2010s. For a long time, some fans feared the worst, that a new Half-Life game would never come and that the series would be on a permanent cliffhanger. That was until a new game was finally announced in November of 2019. Half-Life Alyx came out in March of last year, a new full-length Half-Life game with Alyx Vance as the protagonist. There was a catch though, the game was VR only. Thankfully, I already owned an Oculus Rift when the game launched, but many Half-Life fans were understandably annoyed that only a smaller percentage of the fanbase could play the latest game in a series that had just spent over a decade with no releases. For that reason, I'm not really going to go into any story details or spoilers for the game, but what I can tell you confidently is that Half-Life is back. Alyx takes place from the perspective of the obvious character 5 years before the events of Half-Life 2. The basic gunplay and puzzle solving you know from the rest of the series is mostly intact, if not toned down a little to be more manageable for a person standing in their room without a crouch button or an obvious aiming reticle. Half-Life Alyx is pretty good, but if you didn't think it felt like a real Half-Life game, I might have an alternative for you. Boneworks is a kind of action-adventure puzzle platforming VR shooter that came out in December of 2019, months before Alyx launched, and in all honesty, I think it's the better game in most situations. The advanced physics with simulated weight and a huge arsenal of weapons to use against your enemies makes it feel like a Half-Life game. I mean, it even has a crowbar and headcrab clones for God's sake. Although the strange environment and orange ragdoll enemies distance the game from its inspiration, I think it does some of the things that Half-Life Alyx tried to even better. Aside from that, the arrival of Half-Life Alyx is a breath of fresh air for Valve. If you know the game well, you'll know that a true continuation of Half-Life 2's original story is almost definitely on the way. A real Half-Life 3 is likely on the horizon, and having caught up with the series, I can say I'm just as excited as many others are. Even though it took me years to start playing the games, I know that Half-Life and Half-Life 2 especially have been major influences on my childhood, through the countless hours I've spent on Portal, Gary's Mod, and eventually the main series itself. Half-Life 2 holds up incredibly well in 2021, and I think nearly anybody can go back and enjoy the game now just as much as it was enjoyed 15 years ago. And for Half-Life Alyx, I think the game is the perfect refresher for those who already like the series and want to see Half-Life pushed to its current technological limits. If you still haven't played Half-Life at this point, I hope this gave you the push you needed to take advantage of those outrageous Steam sales and finally try it out. Even if you've never been interested before, the return of Valve's flagship series should give the PC gaming community a lot to look forward to in the coming years, not just for new games, but for the incredible content generated by the community. The dedication that Valve and its fans have to the series is amazing, and I'm really proud to be a part of that. Thank you.